Therese.
Thank you. You were mentioning there about bank has to do various bits of analysis. Who marks their homework on whether a banking hub's needed or not?
So it depends on how they do this. So at present, so this is before the rules come into place, we require them to carry out an analysis. They submit that analysis to us, and then we would discuss that with them and ask for changes if necessary. So, for example, where we feel they have not done enough outreach into the local community, we will ask them to go back and do it. Where we feel that they have not come up with suitable alternatives or identified those properly, we may ask them to pause closures for a period of time. We don't have the power to stop them closing, but that is something we do through the guidance that we have at present.
So can any community approach you and ask for your assessment of the analysis of why they're closing a particular bank and what they're proposing to do instead?
So the firms are required we ask them to publish that analysis. So it's not something that we would give out ourselves. And potentially we'd be bound by confidentiality in terms of how they present that to us at the moment. Under the new rules, we are proposing that they would be required to be more transparent, to publish that analysis. So there are two things. So firstly, there is potential for them to use a coordination body, which we would expect to be designated if that is the case. So that brings a degree of independence into the assessment. We've set some criteria around the sort of things that should be considered. So there's the obvious bits around the geography, but this isn't about getting a tape measure out and saying so many people within a mile or so on. It's about looking also at the demographics of the population, looking further into the geography. So a mile as the crow flies is very different to a mile across a lake in terms of where people may have to travel. So looking at the travel cost, the travel time, and the impact on the customers that they have. So there is a potential that they would use an independent body, and we've encouraged that because we think that is quite important. But we would expect that to be published. And if the local communities are not happy with that, then they can go back and ask for it to be reviewed.
Who can they ask for it to be reviewed?
So they would go back to either the bank or the designated body.
So the government acted, put legislation in place with the support of Parliament, and we're waiting for some of this to happen. I mean, as Dame Angela pointed out, there's a lot of closures happening. Frankly, I think Barclays are shameful, and frankly, they're shameless. They don't care. They really don't care about their communities. Since I became an MP, they've shut down all 8 of their branches. One is about to close, and that's in Leiston. And the sort of information they share with their communities is 86% of people who use our branch have also banked using the app. So what? You'd expect a modern people to be. 64 customers use this branch regularly, they don't define regularly, as the only way to do their banking. Well, surely we should be considering wider elements than that, rather than somebody who just never does online, never does any digital, and then extend to use their branches nearby in the last 12 months. Well, frankly, it is, I've just seen so many of these, we are going to put up a bit of a fight, but I kind of know Barclays just don't care. At least Lloyds and some of the others make an effort. But I'm particularly concerned because the default seems to be, we've done this analysis, we've come to this conclusion, frankly, you're on your own. We might turn up every now and again. Or you can go use the post office. And the reason why I get particularly concerned about it is that the post office itself is now being expected to do more and more. Every bank has a different rule on how much money can be put in or put out. And actually one of the greater impacts as well is not just about vulnerable people and others who aren't quite so either keen to use banking, but frankly it's small businesses who then as a consequence are stopping cash being used in their shops or putting minimum transaction levels on it because of fees. So all this is doing is starting to kill off and dumping the problem on the post office and post office local. At the same time, we're seeing post office local or post office themselves being fewer in number. We're seeing I'm not going to get you into the whole constraints that post office put on how post office local operates. But I know Leiston in particular, it's under this thing now. And I just know that the post offices, the vulnerable people, citizens advice bureau, they're all worried that frankly, this shop that does this post office local almost as a favour to the community will be inundated, and yet there are queues in that same bank branch. So I guess the frustration which our constituents have is that having acted I appreciate it's not about saying every bank must stay open, but it's all too late. And the other thing, which I think you really need to consider, obviously I'll invite you to come back, but I am worried about what it will do to post offices. Also Link and the applications, I know other colleagues will come on about this. You can't apply for Link until all the banks are basically gone. So that you've missed that opportunity, potentially, to have a forward plan. You've missed the opportunity for 2p of people from the bank, the branch, into some hub or whatever it is. And as I say, Barclays in particular just don't seem to care. So it really does concern us that having acted to legislate, it's almost a so what, and we're relying on you, candidly, to help drive some of the behaviour changes in order to help communities. But SMEs are a key part of this as well.
So I'm obviously not going to comment on individual firms. However, I think clearly from our perspective, the less we have to act if the banks are stepping up and doing the assessments properly, moving forward with proper solutions, the better. I think that has to be a better solution. What we are operating within the powers that we have at present. The new powers, I think, enable us to go. Well, they do enable us to go further. So there are a couple of things that I would say with that. Firstly, the Post Office plays a very important role in delivering access to cash for businesses and personal customers, but it's not all about the Post Office. Banking hubs are an important part of it. Obviously, the Post Office provides the facilities within there. Things like ATMs are an important part of it, including deposit ATMs, and there are some trials taking place around sort of further use of deposit ATMs. There's a pilot launching next month through Cash Access UK. But also we've been encouraging the industry to come up with other innovative solutions because there are other ways that you can provide access to cash, and we want them to think about those and think about providing the proper capacity. So one part of the assessment that we will be requiring to carry out is to do a capacity assessment. And I agree with you, it would not be sufficient to have a facility that's open for, say, limited hours with queues going out of the door the whole time. We would expect them to consider the impact on that, and whether that is providing an appropriate service going forward. So I think that itself is an addition that comes under the legislation with our new powers from when the rules come into force. Similarly with Link, that is changing. So there is a process now with Link where Link will consider when the last branch in town closes. We don't consider there still being a branch in town to be sufficient not to carry out that assessment. Sorry, I'll express that in the negative. But so if, for example, you have two branches, one closes but the other one doesn't do SME business, well, we would expect that sort of assessment to be carried out. So our triggers are based around a change in the service. So they would first of all have to identify the change and then assess the impact. Now, the impact may still be fine. You may be able to close a branch of a bank and still have sufficient coverage between a post office and remaining branches. But equally, it could be that there may be remaining branches and that's still not sufficient, so something new needs to come in. So that is being strengthened under the proposed rules.
In terms of the proposals, as has already been pointed out, it's Q3. What can we do now? What can you do now to do transparency? And are there any of your powers that you could use now, but you've set out a consultation? I don't understand why you wouldn't still trigger that capability, because I think you'll see an acceleration in closures while they're waiting for your results.
So, as I said, we do not have the powers currently to prevent closures. That is a commercial decision for the bank. No, okay. But, so we don't have that power currently. What we do have is the branch closure guidance that we have put out. We require banks to treat their customers fairly when they are carrying out the closure. And as I say, we have an agreement from the major banks to pause closures where an alternative has been identified as being needed until that is in place for up to 12 months. When the new powers come in, you can still carry out an assessment, so a community can request an assessment to say there is an existing gap, not a gap that is being caused by a future closure.
What are you waiting for the new powers? Is there a parliamentary procedure that's not been done?
So the firms have not been designated yet in terms of who are the firms who would be required to provide that reasonable access to cash. and we also need to put rules in place to set out what the requirements are specifically and how we would act if needed.
Couldn't you, in effect, now you've got the agreement to the banks, could you not put in effect a moratorium on closures until this designation is done, so that people at least have a chance to understand and be able to, voice their concerns? I mean, it feels to me Barclays are not releasing any information about Leiston apart from what they've selectively chosen to do that suits their argument. Meanwhile, we're getting counter claims, as it were, and it just feels we're not even in limbo. We're being shafted, and we seem powerless to do it because something hasn't happened here, despite the legislation passing. Was it 22 or was it 23?
Last year.
Last year. And that's why I don't understand why you can't do your instruction, power of instruction, to at least have some aspect of moratorium until that assessment is done.
So our powers would be over the designated firms, and those firms have not been designated yet. We do not have the power to put in place a moratorium on closures because we do not have the power to prevent closures.
You said once
currently.
the need has been identified, they've agreed to do a 12-month kind of.
So they've agreed. So they have agreed. So if a bank now announces a closure, there's an assessment carried out that identifies there is a need for something additional. They have agreed to pause that closure for a period of up to 12 months to enable that solution to be put in place.
It comes back to my first question: who makes the judgment that a need has been identified?
So currently they're using Link, is doing an independent assessment of the need that is there.
Okay.
So in which case they're paid for by the banks, correct. And also Link then make the decision about whether there's a banking hub or not. It feels very odd. Anyway, thank you.
It absolutely does, and I think we've hit on an important point there about the designation. Are we going to be able to designate anyone before the end of your consultation?
Not before. The consultation ends on the 8th of February, so
okay.
No.
Okay.
That's not my expectation.
What about before the end of your period when you might respond to the consultation?
But for firms to respond and others to respond to the consultation.
Designation can happen any time after.
So designation, so that's a matter for the Treasury when they will come up with the designation.
But they could do that any time after the 8th.
They could do that any time when they obviously need to think of it. It's irrelevant. Well, yes and no. So the major firms will, of course, be expecting to be designated. What we don't know is how far that designation would extend. So whether there's a possibility of some extras.
They could do some initial ones, couldn't they?
I don't see that as a blockage to us taking the rules forward, but we do need to enable firms who are designated, if they were, for example, weren't expecting it, to consider the impact. But that doesn't mean we need to push back our consultation. It means we will take representation from them if needed afterwards.